The cries of the Hebrew women mingled with the stifling heat of the Egyptian sun. Every day, new mothers had their children torn from their arms and thrown into the river, obeying Pharaoh's cruel order. It was a time of fear and despair, but in the midst of this gloomy scenario, a little girl with alert eyes and a strong spirit was born, Miriam. She grew up among the tents of the enslaved people, listening to ancient stories about divine promises and deliverance. From an early age, she learned to carry water jugs, prepare bread dough, and observe everything around her. But nothing prepared her for the day when her mother, with tears in her eyes, placed a small baby in her arms. Moses, his brother. He couldn't cry out loud. He couldn't be seen. For 3 months, the family did their best to hide him from the Egyptian soldiers. Miriam saw her mother becoming more and more tense, her father silent, the worry weighing on everyone. But the child was growing, and there was no longer any way to hide him. It was then that her mother made an unthinkable decision. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with a financial aid by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. In the darkness before dawn, Miriam followed in her mother's footsteps to the banks of the Nile. Her heart was pounding as she watched the small basket being carefully placed in the water among the reeds. The river looked hungry, its dark waters whispering secrets of lives lost there. But Miriam's mother prayed silently, trusting God's invisible hands to guide that fragile reed boat. When her mother left, Miriam stayed. Crouched among the tall leaves, her eyes wide, she didn't blink. What would happen now? Who would find the baby first, the current or a pious heart? The sound of footsteps on the sand brought the answer. Miriam shrank further into the reeds when she saw the figures approaching. They were Egyptian women, their dresses fluttering in the wind, their laughter echoing like distant bells. But one of them was different. Her haughty bearing, the golden ornaments, and the way the servants surrounded her made it clear she was the Pharaoh's daughter. She was walking nonchalantly, her feet touching the warm water, when something caught her eye. The small basket swayed gently among the river plants, as if the Nile itself were offering it to her. The princess stopped, narrowed her eyes, and made a gesture. 2 maidservants ran over, picked up the basket, and opened it. Moses' cry tore through the silence. Miriam held her breath. What would they do now? Would the baby be thrown into the river like so many others? But to her surprise, the princess didn't show horror or contempt. On the contrary, her face softened and an unexpected smile appeared on her lips. With a delicate touch, she removed the cloth covering the child and murmured something to her servants. Miriam knew at that moment that it was time to act. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she ignored her fear and came out of hiding. With quick, careful steps, she approached the group. Her gaze met the princess's for a brief second before her voice sounded firm, as if the whole thing was a well-rehearsed plan. "Madam, would you like me to find a Hebrew woman to nurse this child for you?" The princess arched her eyebrows. Miriam waited, keeping her eyes downcast. Time seemed to drag on until Pharaoh's daughter nodded, a curious glint in her eye. "Go," she said. Miriam didn't have to listen twice. She turned on her heels and ran, crossing the bank without looking back. She already knew exactly where to go. Miriam's feet barely touched the ground as she ran. The wind blew in her face, but nothing could stop the urgency that burned inside her. Every beat of her heart seemed to mark the hurried pace of her strides. She had to get there before anything else happened, before they changed their minds, before Moses was taken away forever. When she reached the entrance to the tent, she didn't need to say anything. Her mother, who was already carrying the weight of so many silent tears, saw in her daughter's eyes that something had happened. Miriam grabbed her hand and pulled hard, dragging her out before any questions could be asked. The walk back seemed much longer than the hurried escape. What would they say to them? What would the princess do? But Miriam held her head high, her gaze fixed ahead. She had spoken with certainty before. She needed to keep that same strength now. When they reached the riverbank, the princess observed the Hebrew woman her little messenger had brought. Her eyes traveled over Jochebed's face, and something in Moses' mother's expression made her nod, as if she already knew the truth and had decided to keep it quiet. "Take this child and nurse him for me," said the princess, her voice firm but with a touch of unexpected tenderness. "I'll give you a reward." Jochebed took the little one in her arms once again. The son she had delivered to the river was back, but now under the protection of Pharaoh's own daughter. Miriam held her breath, trying to contain her smile. They had succeeded. Time passed, and Moses grew up in the arms of the woman who really was his mother. Pharaoh's palace seemed like another world, far removed from the dust and stifling heat of the Hebrew tents. Inside, the corridors were cold, the columns huge, and the servants hurried about, bowing their heads before the royal family. Moses grew up in this setting, wrapped in gold and silk, eating the Egyptians' delicacies and learning their culture. But despite everything, Miriam knew he wasn't one of them. She sometimes saw him from afar, walking alongside princes and generals, learning the art of war, the secrets of the stars, the language of the pharaohs. Farther and farther away, less and less the boy she had helped to protect. Time was shaping him, but deep in his eyes there was still something that connected him to the people who suffered in the furnaces and the fields. Miriam saw her mother look at him with a mixture of pride and pain. He was safe, yes, but for how long? His name was still Moses, the one saved from the waters, but the current of fate was dragging him towards something greater. Time passed. The boy became a man, and then one day everything changed. The news came like thunder to the Hebrews. Moses had killed an Egyptian, not just any Egyptian, but a foreman, one of those who imposed the whip and humiliation on slaves. He saw the injustice, couldn't contain his rage, and acted. But Pharaoh's fury was even greater. Miriam learned that her brother had fled. Where? No one knew. The palace that had sheltered him for so long was now a forbidden place. He had become a man without land, a fugitive. Time moved on like sand carried by the desert wind. The years passed, and Moses became just a distant memory, a name whispered among the Hebrews when they spoke of the lost son who grew up among princes and then disappeared. Miriam, however, never forgot. Deep down, something told her that her brother's story had not yet come to an end. And then he came back. Not as the young man in noble robes who once walked among the Egyptians, but as a man marked by the desert. His clothes were simple. His face bore the harshness of years spent away from everything. But what was most striking was not his appearance. It was the authority in his voice. He spoke like someone who had seen God himself, and he carried a message. Miriam listened attentively as Moses told of the encounter that had changed his life. God had called him from the middle of a burning bush. He had been given a mission to free the people from slavery. It was hard to believe. The brother who had run away was now returning to face Pharaoh, to challenge an entire empire. But when Moses spoke, something inside her ignited. The same certainty that had once made her watch the basket in the river pulsed in her chest again. Yes, it was real. Aaron, her other brother, believed it too. And together the three of them became the front line of a divine revolution. Moses would be the voice before Pharaoh. Aaron, the spokesman for the people. And Miriam, she was there among the women, among the afflicted Hebrews, being a beacon of hope. And then the signs began. The Nile was dyed in blood. Frogs covered the land, plagues, darkness, destruction. With every blow Egypt received, it became clearer that this was not Moses' whim. It was the hand of God himself moving on behalf of his people. But it wasn't the end yet. The greatest test was yet to come. The last plague fell over Egypt like a shadow that no one could stop. Cries echoed through the houses of the Egyptians as death passed over them, taking their firstborn. But among the Hebrews, silence reigned. The The gates marked with blood were a reminder of God's promise. He would deliver them, and he did. When Pharaoh finally gave in, the news spread like wildfire through dry straw. It was time to leave. The women needed bread in a hurry, with no time to let the dough ferment. Men gathered their belongings. Children were carried on their laps. It was an exodus, a displacement of thousands of people towards an uncertain but promising future. And Miriam was among them. She saw Moses in front, his staff firmly in hand, leading the crowd away from slavery. They walked through the desert, feeling the taste of freedom still mixed with the fear of the unknown. But the journey would not be easy. Despair set in when the Hebrews found themselves trapped between the sea and the Egyptian army that was coming at them furiously. Cries of terror spread like wildfire. Some thought of giving up, others wondered if they had been freed only to die there. But Moses didn't move. He raised his staff over the waters, and in front of everyone, the impossible happened. The sea opened up. The wind howled, the waters rose up like living walls on either side. A dry path formed in front of them. At first, they hesitated, but then the footsteps began, and the people crossed. And when the last Hebrew stepped onto dry land, the waters closed in behind them, swallowing up the enemy army. Miriam couldn't contain her euphoria. She picked up her tambourine, and her voice broke the silence of the desert. Other women followed her, dancing and singing. The victory was not just Moses. It belonged to everyone. It was hers too. The dust of the desert settled little by little, but something inside Miriam was still stirring. In the days following the crossing of the sea, she realized that her brother was more than just a leader. The people didn't see Moses as an ordinary man. They saw him as a chosen one sent by God. And that began to bother her. Ever since Egypt, she had been by his side. It was she who watched over his basket in the river. It was she who ran to fetch his mother and make sure he was breastfed by her own family. It was she who sang of victory when they escaped Pharaoh's clutches. But now Moses seemed unreachable. He went up to the mountain to talk to God. He received divine instructions. He made decisions that no one dared question. And Miriam, she was also chosen. She too was a prophetess. She also had a voice. The seed of dissatisfaction was growing. And then came the fuse. Moses had married a Shuhite woman, a foreigner. This upset Miriam and Aaron. But the marriage wasn't the real problem. The truth, which perhaps even she didn't want to admit, was something else. Why did only Moses have such a high position? Why did God speak directly to him and not to them too? The words began as a whisper, then a whisper. And then Miriam and Aaron confronted Moses. It was a conversation poisoned by unresolved resentments. "Has the Lord only spoken through Moses?" she asked. "Hasn't he also spoken through us?" But God listened. The silence in the camp was different that morning. A heavy silence, charged with something no one dared to name. The cloud hung over the tent, and everyone knew what that meant. God had come down to speak. But this time, it wasn't to Moses. Miriam felt a chill run through her skin as the Lord's voice rang out, loud as thunder cutting through the sky. He called them Moses, Aaron, and Hur. Without a choice, they walked to the entrance of the tent, their feet heavy, their hearts tight. When they arrived, the divine voice rose once again, this time full of indignation. "If there are prophets among you, I reveal myself to them in visions and dreams, but not so with my servant Moses. I speak to him face to face." Miriam lowered her head. Every word weighed on her like a stone. God wasn't just defending Moses, he was making it clear that there was a difference, and that difference could not be disputed. Then, without warning, the cloud lifted. Judgment had been passed. Horror washed over Aaron's face before Miriam even understood what had happened. As she looked at her own hands, the scream caught in her throat. His skin was as white as snow, but not pure. It was leprosy. Shock came before fear, then despair. The people around her began to murmur, some instinctively moving away. The punishment couldn't have been clearer. She, who had felt left out, was now truly separate, excluded, unclean. Aaron turned to Moses, his voice choked with supplication. "My Lord, please don't make us carry this sin." But Moses needed no convincing. Without hesitation, he raised his eyes and cried out to God, "Oh God, please heal her." The request was heard, but the answer didn't come immediately. There was a sentence to be carried out. Miriam had to face the consequences. The whole camp watched as Miriam was led out. No one dared approach. The silence among the people was cut only by the rustling of the wind in the desert and the sound of the slow steps of the woman who, for so long, had been a leader among them. Now she was marked, separated, 7 days. That was the appointed time. For a week, Miriam remained outside the camp, isolated like someone impure, someone whose body bore the consequences of her own mistake. No one knew what was going on in her mind during those days, but those who knew her could imagine. Far from the tents, the familiar voices, the songs of victory, only the sound of her own heart remained. How many times throughout her life had she spoken with confidence, led with courage, raised her voice in praise? Now her voice found no one to listen. But the people didn't leave. For 7 days, the whole crowd stood there waiting. No one would go forward without them. Moses, Aaron, every man, woman, and child knew that the journey would not continue until Miriam was restored. And then, on the 7th day, the healing came. Her skin returned to normal. The leprosy that had separated her was gone. But something inside her had changed too. When she returned to the camp, there was no feast, no celebration. There was no reason for it. The leader who had previously sung in front of the women returned in silence, and the people moved on because there was still a way to go. The desert seemed endless. The sun burned down on the tents. The wind brought with it the bitter taste of sand, and the days dragged on like shadows on the horizon. The people walked on, always moving forward, but never arriving. The promises seemed distant, and hope oscillated between faith and doubt. Miriam was still among them. She no longer led songs, no longer stood in front of the women with a tambourine in her hands. Time had made her quieter, more observant. The years weighed on her shoulders, and the desert had shaped her soul as much as it shaped those who followed alongside her. Then, one day, her time came. There was no thunder, no divine voice echoing in the camp. It wasn't like before, when her life had been by the river, when she had danced after crossing the sea, or when leprosy had driven her away from the people. There was no great event, just the passage of time, relentless, taking her where everyone would one day go. Miriam died there, in the desert of Zin, far from the promised land, far from what she had hoped to achieve for so many years. Her body was buried there in the dust of a place of passage, and the people mourned her departure. Because despite everything, she was Miriam, the girl who looked after Moses, the woman who sang of God's victory, the prophetess who had her voice silenced by her own mistakes, but who never stopped walking. The camp moved on. Moses and Aaron continued their journey, knowing that they too would soon find the end of their road. But Miriam's story didn't end in that forgotten tomb in the desert. Her life still spoke, still taught, still echoed among those who remembered her strength, her faith, and her failures. The desert wind erased Miriam's footprints over time, but her story was never lost. The people moved on, the years passed, new generations were born, and the promised land was reached. But her name remained, whispered among those who remembered. Miriam was chosen even before she understood the weight of this calling. As a young girl, she protected Moses without hesitation. She grew up knowing that God had a purpose for her brother, but also for her. She was a prophetess, a leader among women, a witness to the greatest miracles the world has ever seen. But, like any of us, she also faced her own inner war. Her biggest mistake wasn't questioning Moses, but forgetting for a moment that her calling was never lower than her brother's. It was just different. Envy clouded her vision. The desire for recognition made her forget that serving God was never about status, but about purpose. And when she challenged her God-given authority, she had to face the consequences. But her story wasn't just about her mistake. Miriam didn't abandon the people after her discipline. She didn't run away. She didn't give up. She stayed. She continued to walk. She continued to be part of the story, even if in silence. And perhaps this is one of the greatest lessons she leaves us. We are not defined by the moments when we fail, but by what we do afterwards. Miriam fell, but she got up. She lost her voice, but not her faith. She died before seeing the promise fulfilled, but her life was part of it. And to this day, when we remember her, we don't just remember the leprosy or the rebuke. We remember the girl who waited by the river, the woman who raised her tambourine while crossing the sea, the leader who, despite everything, remained faithful to her people. Because the true mark of a life is not in never making a mistake, but in continuing to walk, even when the road seems too long. If you liked Miriam's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.